Good evening. This is Mae Brussell. The title of this broadcast is World Watchers. It's program number 760, June the 30th, 1986. I'm still in a state of shock after learning and sharing with you last week the information that William Graham, the former acting director of NASA at the time of the Challenger, went down, has been promoted to a dual role with Ronald Reagan for one, the Office of Science and Technology Policy, and the other science advisor to the president. So there's a lot of evidence and material that I'll share with you next week, not this time. I don't want to interrupt too much on the Challenger, this program, that it was this William Graham who suggested to the president in January, early January, that he should use in his State of the Union message, January 27th in the evening, that Krista McAuliffe, the teacher in space, would be up there, and they would synchronize the State of the Union message with the shuttle space program. And it was William Graham who wrote the speech that Ronald Reagan was to give, and he's been promoted in the White House. He's the gentleman who was the acting director of NASA who did not even watch the launch take off. He was in the halls or room with a particular congressman from New Mexico, and he had prepared that evening's speech for the President of the United States, and he is, as I say, going to be in charge of biology and the science parts of our country under the protective wing of the President. The two of them have so much on each other that it's really important that he got moved into this White House position. Now, an article came out of New Times Magazine, that's similar to Time Magazine, from the Soviet Union, finally writing a section on the nuclear plant in Germany that was leaking while they were blaming the Soviet Union for all of the nuclear material that was flying over Europe and around the world. The article is called Shifting the Blame, written by Mr. Tolpagin from the Soviet Union. Late last month, a group of reporters were invited to visit the atomic power plant in Hamm, North Rhine-Westphalia. They were to write about the reactor, then doing a trial run, which, according to the plant's management, included or precludes the risk of environmental radioactive contamination, even the incredible contingency of a series of errors provoking an accident. It's interesting that they had a contingency of provocation that they wouldn't leak, and I believe that the Chernobyl was a provocateur situation that the Soviet Union did not have a contingency for. The article goes on, the news stories were intended to back up the arrogant and totally unsubstantiated claims by authorities that West Germany's atomic plants are the world's most reliable. However, nothing came of it. The reporters were to visit the station on May 31st, but the day before, a spokesman for the Freiburg Institute of Ecology announced that on May 4th, a heightened level of radioactivity had been recorded in the soil in the neighborhood of the plant, probably due to an accident there, yet to all inquiries from the Institute, the plant's management said everything was in hand. That's the May 4th date that I had cited. It later transpired that an accident had indeed occurred, causing a radioactive outburst. However, the owners of the firm that operates the Hamm reactor attempted a cover-up by ascribing the radioactivity to Chernobyl. On May the 12th, they declared in a letter to the Landfrag, that must be an office of radioactivity and so forth, it said the radioactivity recorded in the vicinity of the reactor is due exclusively to the accident Chernobyl atomic plant. Chiefly responsible were the extraordinarily adverse meteorological conditions, especially the heavy rain. All rumors that reactor damage is to blame for the heightened radioactivity are completely unfounded, the rumors that Germany would do it. In mid-May, a group of Landtag deputies from the Free Democratic Party visited the Hamm plant. The Chernobyl plant went off on May the 26th, was discovered in Sweden May the 28th, and this is the follow-up, April the 26th to April 28th, and then May the 4th is when the German plant was leading the radioactivity out of that area, and it was not the Chernobyl plant, and it was on shortwave radio at this time, but covered up. The article goes on, in mid-May, a group of Landtag deputies for the Free Democratic Party visited the Hamm plant. As I said, they were not told anything about the accident either when they visited. This is while Shortwave Moscow is telling everybody around the world. On the contrary, they were shown a publicity trailer that promoted the advantages of this type of reactor, the brainchild of a West German engineer. What we are dealing with is a deliberate deception of both Parliament and public, which also implicates officials of the land's Ministry of Economics, whom the plant management notified of the accident, though, and it is true, after some delay. They waited and didn't tell them about their accident, the very thing that the Soviet Union was accused of. Only after the whole affair had come to light and local peasants and environmentalists demonstrated outside the plant was a commission set up to institute an inquiry. The heads of the power firm and officials of the Economics Ministry did not organize the exercise to cover up their own negligence alone. That isn't why they did it. Any news of a radioactive leak from the Ham plant would have jarred with the anti-Soviet campaign mounted in the Federal Republic of Germany over the Chernobyl accident. The independent capitalist press in both official and quasi-official bulletins had fabrications. They both featured fabrications, noting the unreliability of Soviet atomic plants and the merits of Western, especially German, technology. The tune for this unseeming leak campaign was set by the leaders of the government coalition. In quotes, the Chernobyl reactor would never have been granted permission to operate in the Federal Republic, end quote. Chancellor Helmut Kohl told the Bundestag on May 14th, to the applause of like-minded deputies who have very hazy notions of nuclear power engineering. He said he was unhappy with the information blockade that the Soviet Union had supposedly erected around the events at Chernobyl, and it should be noted that it was said afterwards that the West German government had been officially notified of the Chernobyl accident after Hans Blix, Director General of the International Atomic Energy, visited the site, and many news conferences were held in Moscow. Spokesmen for the ruling parties conducted themselves in quite a different manner when the Ham accident took place, and it was debated in the Bundestag in response to a demand from the Greens party. And once again, the Greens were active on this, just as they were the ones that opened up the advanced genetic sciences and their plans to use the live bacteria in Monterey County. The article concludes no one of them spoke of an information blockade when it came to their side or a desire to keep everything under the wraps, which they did against the Soviet Union. On the contrary, they took up cudgels for the management of the Ham plant and accused the opposition of fanning a panic by pressing for a full inquiry. Social Democrat Hermann Heinemann, labor minister in the North Rhine-Westphalia government, called attempts to sweep the Ham accident under the carpet unprecedented and swinish. And it's interesting that if the one was set up by agent provocateurs in the Soviet Union at Chernobyl, the timing was perfect because the May 31st was the date for the Freiburg Institution of Ecology to invite people in from the world to see how German plants don't leak, and the other would be leaking. The only problem was that the one they were going to demonstrate was, in fact, leaking. Now I'm going on to some very important matters that are taking place in the United States. We cover a lot of the major stories often, and right in our own backyards, we're not really adequately covering what is going on. And I really should be updating many, many, many deaths and murders, but I have gone on to other issues, and I want to just go through a couple of these with you. There is a book out that Edward R. Hamilton, the book dealer, has right now on sale for a small price. It's called Broken Promises. The title is it's called Broken Promises and then dash Racism in American Sports. It's by Richard Lapchick. The subject is what happened to the political science professor when he wanted to prevent a Davis Cup match between the United States and South Africa. The book is described as a horrifying analysis of how racism in American sports is high at all levels from high school to professionals. It's now on sale. It's usually $14.95. It's $2.95. The book dealer's address is Falls Village, Connecticut. Zip code, hope you have a pencil when you listen to World Watches or tape it, 06031-0358, Broken Promises, Racism, and Athletics. Now, I was watching CBS Sunday Morning yesterday. I usually get up and watch that. And there was a segment on Roberto Clemente. Many of you remember him, some of you don't. He was a very active, politically aware and active black Puerto Rican baseball player, very talented, and really coming up to be one of the major baseball players in America. And this segment discussed the type of racism he was confronted with. When Clemente's plane went down in 1972, he was on a goodwill mission to help the impoverished in Nicaragua. And I believed at the time that that was a murder of Roberto Clemente, a black activist, as well as a potentially very, very prominent sports person. And he was well known, but he could possibly break many records if he had survived. The plane went down on the way from Nicaragua in 1972. One plane that left there after the earthquake was allegedly Howard Hughes. At that point, I believe it was Vance Cooper, and Somoza was supposed to have been to the plane to see him. In return for going up the steps and down, he got an airplane from this Hughes Corporation. At the time, I was suspicious of the circumstances of the earthquake and believed it could be tested as a way to cause earthquakes. And that was a long time ago, 1972, but I was thinking about that 13, 14 years ago. Well, this week they're having a postage stamp for Roberto Clemente commemorating his death. In 1979, November 30th, 1979, the Federal Aviation was found liable for the plane crash that killed Clemente, and the federal judge had decided that the plane, he was on a McDonnell Douglas DC-7, that the pilot was not capable of flying this plane. The plane was overloaded. The co-pilot wasn't qualified, and there were problems with his Mercy flight into Nicaragua. Here's a black Puerto Rican going into Somoza's Nicaragua. He didn't make it back. And just the same week that they are issuing a postage stamp for him, two other well-known athletes on their way to becoming very, very big and already recognized as top stars, Don Rogers and Len Bias, died. Now, your newspapers are filled with stories on their deaths, and I'm not going into all the details. The front page stories right off the bat, such as Don Rogers, drugs likely caused death of NFL star, doctor says. Tells how he went to a bachelor's party. He was to be married the next day. Came home at 3 a.m., woke up at 8, said, "Mom, you better get help," became comatose, and died. And the articles describe this mysterious death. And now the doctors are trying to say it was drugs, without a history of drugs. And they're trying to say not only Rogers, but Lenny Bias's death is a matter of drugs. It was unusual for their character, for their personality, but they were black men trying to make it up into the system and just about getting there. The Newsweek Time magazine has a picture of Mr. Bias. It's titled "An Empty Dream." Len Bias dies at 22, and Newsweek, I started to say, has the lead thing, The Mystery of a Star's Death. And the newspapers, L.A. Herald, and the newspapers I was reading all began with the mystery. Well, when they say it's a mystery, it's a humdinger, because usually the solution and cause of death is cited immediately. Nobody hardly uses the mystery. William Raspberry, who's a syndicated black writer, he is to the blacks what Roy Cohn is to the Jews in terms of understanding what is going on, and he plays all the games within the system, talks about the lessons of these deaths, and then said, shouldn't we face the painful truth that no matter how venal the supplier might be, he probably didn't force drugs on anybody. Now that is an outright stupidity, lie, cover-up. There are people like Lenny Bruce and Janis Joplin or John Belushi who took drugs. But if somebody wanted to kill them, you make sure that there's a poison in the drug that kills them, not the drug. The drug didn't kill him. It could be the poison. If you want to get rid of him, you can. I have a very brilliant friend, a black man, who explained to me how these things happen and why. Because if each of these men could make $1 million a year, they'd move into your neighborhood, my neighborhood, white neighborhoods, and their children would go to the same private schools. Their daughter would marry your son, or your son would marry their daughter. And in order to keep the society segregated from all the races except white Anglo-Saxon Catholics and Protestants, the way to cut off is to kill those people that are earning a lot of money, that are straight, that would move into your places, that can be killed without a trace of their being killed. And to accept the fact that the one taste of drug for a first-time person, and when each of them are getting honors and moving up in their careers the very next days, it's totally impossible to believe that they could die in the way that is stated. Now, in Texas, there's been a lot of murders that I haven't covered with you at Huntsville, and it's very important to go into some of these prison murders and what is happening. But there was a story just a few weeks ago from the Houston Post, June the 6th. A prisoner there, Ronnie Beller, was heard by inmates screaming and pleading, save my life, and he's crying for his life to be saved, and there's footsteps in the cell, and then he's found hanging in the cell, and it's not so easy to do that either in those prisons, and the investigation of the grand jury took only a few minutes, according to the Houston Post, and decided it was indeed a suicide, and nobody was charged for having, hung him up there, even though he was pleading for his life, and the other people could hear him. That was the end of him, and because he wasn't beaten, or there's no signs of being beaten, they said he committed suicide, and while he was pleading for help. There were 2 murders in Oakland area, Contra Costa County, that you may or may not have gotten on the East Coast or the South or the North. I don't get the murders that come from your local area, and I don't know if you get all of them here. The Ku Klux Klan and the Nazi Party, the Aryan nations, have been very active. That's the milieu of Ed Meese and Ronald Reagan and the powers that be in their political heyday, and a lot of that White House mafia come from this area and worked there. And just this last November 1985, a young art student who was about to go to Milan, a black student, he missed the last bus at the BART station, called his roommate, and between that telephone call and Neverland, he was hung on a tree, and it was called suicide, even though he had a brilliant career, had all of his rockers, wasn't a drug dealer, a drug taker, or anything, and he was hung on a tree. The same night he was hung, 2 men dressed in their clown outfits were caught with knives, stabbing 2 black people in the area. Now, this past week, another black woman was found nearby, near the same area where Timothy Lee was, and it was a situation where they said, we found a note, and we're handling it as a suspicious death, but there seems to be a suicide note, and so the hanging is officially, by June 28th, declared a suicide. Although there was substantial evidence for a suicide, there was no evidence for a criminal act, so it was called a suicide, and even if she wrote a note, it wouldn't make a bit of difference. The San Francisco Examiner-Chronicle had an article about the San Quentin Six and the retrial of Stephen Bingham. He never was tried. He left after 6 people were killed in San Quentin prison, including George Jackson, the political activist. And in the process of describing the acquittal of Bingham, and I haven't done enough on this program on the San Quentin Six and that trial that's been going on to April. Since April, I don't think I've done anything. They cited the late-faced Stender, described by Eric Brazil in the San Francisco Examiner, an intense, energetic attorney whose commitment to prison reform may have killed her. She said, I am convinced that the prison is a totally lawless society. She was busy with various activists trying to help the prison system, and a group of people that she had helped. One member of that group got out of prison and went to her home, and before he shot her, he had her write a confession that she betrayed George Jackson before he was killed in 1971. Well, why would a black guerrilla member of a prison gang make her, just before she dies, for all purposes she was dead, and she was left paralyzed with a bullet in her spine, and then she took a trip, I believe, to Hong Kong, and she died 1 year later, far out of sight of everybody, away from here, or the Bay Area. But before she was shot and left for dead, she was forced to write a note. Well, if you're going to be killed, why write your note? In the same way, these people, if you're going to have a gun there, why write a suicide note? But the point is that there are cases where people are told at gunpoint to write notes, and then, like, do you have a last will to say to somebody because you're going to be dead? Well, I would leave a message for them. That wouldn't mean I had a suicide. It mean I'm going to be murdered and I wanted to say something, and that doesn't mean that I'm going to hang myself out of a tree or in a tree. So she wrote, was writing that she betrayed Jackson. Well, if Jackson was dead in 1971 and she was shot in 1979, why would she bother to write it? The whole point is that it is a technique used under the pointed gun and then you're shot afterwards. Now, the whole result or aftermath of the Stephen Bingham entry into San Quentin, he allegedly brought in a gun that George Jackson used for an escape attempt that he put in his wig, and none of those guys had wigs in prison. They weren't even allowed to have hardly anything. A toothbrush was considered a weapon in those days, and I was very active in that time period from 1970 through 1974, going in the prisons of California and working with various prisoners. In this trial of Stephen Bingham, he was acquitted, and the newspaper article described it as the last hurrah for prison reform that was to take place. Everyone stayed out of the prison after this shootout in 1971. Everyone who was going to help until 1972 when the SLA came in from Indiana, the narcotics squad, Emily William Harris and Gary and Angela Atwood, and they went into the prison and started working with the Black Guerrilla family because they were agent provocateurs that were ready to set up the kidnapping of Patty Hearst for Edwin Meese and Ronald Reagan and the California powers that be. And the people that were doing the good work in the prisons were kind of eased out at this particular time. But if Bingham is innocent, if a jury of 12 decides that he didn't bring a gun and that George Jackson had no wig, then who did the shooting and who brought the gun into the prison? Louis Tackwood, agent provocateur with the LAPD, describes it in Glasshouse Tapes, the incidences and the role of the Los Angeles Police Department, and again, the California Criminal Intelligence with the supervision of Meese and Reagan going up and down the coast. So when it's not Stephen Bingham that could have brought in the gun, then the case is over now and for all. It should lead to try the state policies and open up the allegations of the police department working as agent provocateurs. But it won't. The same thing happened with the attempted killing of John Paul II. Frank Turpel and Theodore Shackley and Francesco Pazienza and the Italian Seisman, that's just like the California Intelligence, and Paul Hentz of the CIA and Claire Sterling, Alexander Haig of NATO. All these officials were linked directly to the assassination attempt of the Pope, or may hopefully to kill the Pope, to blame the KGB and the Soviet Union for killing the Pope, the Polish Pope. But when it didn't work and all the evidence at the trial came to the right wing and the official authorities, then the trial is over. A second trial doesn't begin. If some are acquitted, it doesn't begin. And so the San Quentin 6 story is, in a sense, over, but it isn't over because those officials are now in the White House running the country. Faye Stender was murdered. George Jackson was murdered. Popeye Jackson, who headed the United Prisoners Union, was a friend of mine. I was in his apartment 2 weeks before he was murdered. FLEETA DRUMGO, one of the San Quentin 6, was murdered. John Cluchette is alive. Hugo Pinnell and Rochelle McGee are locked up in prison, and nobody is helping them with their work. And Charles Gary, one of the attorneys at the time, was working with Jim Jones and Mark Lane and was in Jonestown when 912 people were murdered and sat out there allegedly with a hairdryer, fixing his hair and getting ready for press conferences. Well, so much for the California violences, but they're not just in California. They are a national policy, and these athletes are part of a national, and so locally we're getting hangings by the tree in clans and a tip of the iceberg of the prison system. And Stephen Bingham's getting off is no great miracle. Stephen Bingham, like John DeLorean or Dan White, is white, and the jury can't have trouble with a white man doing it. If it was a black man sitting in the chair, it would have been a different story, and I'm not so sure he would have been acquitted. Even on that evidence, the others were charged with murder. So if the evidence is so slim, it locks some men up and it separates the white man, and now he's out free on the streets. Now, if anybody has doubts on the way the system works, the CIA, the Pentagon, the National Security Agency, I'll just cite off quickly a couple of items. I've put them in my filing cabinet, 26 drawers, A to Z, of people I believe that have been murdered by this system. And the athletes, of course, fall into that category, Don Rogers and Len Bias. But I just pulled out a few articles, not to do the whole broadcast, but a few to get the idea of how this system gets away with what they do. September 17, 1975, Jack Anderson said the CIA has domestically trained assassination teams that are trained to kill without leaving clues. That isn't overseas, that's just domestically. William Stevenson, who wrote The Borman Brotherhood, not the William Stevenson of Intrepid, British American intelligence, but the one who wrote Borman Brotherhood, describes how the system, our system and other countries have what they call hydrocyanic acid, which causes heart failure and leaves no trace. These chemicals are many, and no matter what the autopsy, it leaves no trace. Jack Anderson in 1981 was writing an article, Assassination Games. He said the secret killers of the Central Intelligence Agency have a scenario. They carry deadly poisons. They leave no symptoms at all for the first 48 hours. Some of it they were going to put to Muammar Gaddafi, but he also described how they use them domestically inside the United States. They cause a paralysis, a coma, and then a death. Now, there's no reason to believe that the people who killed Don Rogers or Len Bias and many other people with these heart attacks, such as Adlai Stevenson, were present with them and did something to them and were foreigners in a crowd among very, very close friends. That would be too conspicuous. But as Frank Turple and the CIA explained in various documents and books that they have a substance that you put on the shoulder of somebody and it seeps into their skin, and 2 days later they die, and there's no trace of the cause of death. Well, in these cases, you sprinkle a little cocaine in the car and spread it around, and that's so easy. Or you turn a pocket inside out and you say it's a robbery. The author of The White Hand, an article, this was printed in Penthouse a few years ago. The authors are Ernest Volkman and John Cummings. Volkman's written some very good books on Nazis, and I don't want to cite all of his books at this time, but he has quite a few to his credit. And he wrote in Penthouse an article called The White Hand. Now, that's a group that works violently anti-Semitic, very, very racist, part of the league that links to the Aryan nations that wants to cut the throat of every black and Jew and hang them from poles from one end of the coast to the other to kill every black in America. And he had a long article in Penthouse on The White Hand in which he states that over 1,000 CIA-trained killers have formed their own Murder Incorporated, and now the CIA is worried that this independent terror network is permanently out of control. Well, he misses the point that they're worried. The CIA looks the other way while they continue to wipe out particular people because they are as racist as the White Hand. Another way to kill people that was documented in many books, and it was described in the City News in London in 1978, is with poison darts. A particular gentleman working with Radio Free America and with the Central Intelligence Agency, many of you remember the case, was in London, and he got a shot of a poison pellet. George Markov, a prominent Bulgarian defector. But the CIA could have killed the defector to blame the Soviet Union because he was on the outside now. And he did work with the CIA in Radio Free Europe, and he got a poison dart that went into his body that was so minute. And this article from London goes on to tell about suspected bacteria and the use of bacteria against civilians, and these people are directly linked and named in along with the CIA. At the time of the Watergate hearings, E. Howard Hunt told about wanting to kill Jack Anderson or make him appear incoherent and ramble, but the method was to put poison on the steering wheel of the car and it would go through the skin, and the plan then was discarded. But this gentlemen who drive their car, Don Rogers or Len Bias, and many others, all they have to do is drive a car or be in public place with press conferences, which they both were, one coming to Sacramento to get married, one just joining the Celtics and having all these awards and attention. Frank Church, who died of CIA cancer shortly after his investigations, has a press conference here. It was in the LA Times, September 1975. CIA kept poisons against orders. And this is when his Congressional Committee Senate was looking into poisons, and it goes into the fact that at Fort Detrick, Maryland, that allegedly Richard Nixon had told them to stop chemical and biological warfare, but they kept chemicals that cause massive number of deaths. They attack the human nervous system. They can be spread by air, water, and other means, and they were available, and they never were thrown away, and those kind of things can be in the environment of a particular person if you don't want to have them move in your neighborhood or see your families or send their children to the colleges where you go. A Dr. Edward M. Gunn for the CIA described E. Howard Hunt and various agents coming to him and how he had medicines that could be absorbed through the skin that they're the stockpile of the CIA. April 12, 1979, I had this on a program, World Watchers, April the 6th, going back 1979 broadcast. Well, I don't know how the broadcast preceded the article. One of them isn't dated right. But the article is CIA studied natural causes of killing. They want to knock off key guys with cancer and heart attacks. Those were two of the things. And, of course, the heart attacks were such that they would never be noticeable. The cancer, you wouldn't know where it started, but they wouldn't leave a trace. And we have perfected those systems of cancer and heart attacks. Dorothy Kilgallen, a newspaper reporter who went to see Jack Ruby, died right afterwards. Jack Ruby charged with killing Lee Harvey Oswald under what they described as curious circumstances. They were mysterious. The cause attributed to it was drug overdose, similar to Don Rogers and Len Bias, probably a woman who never had drugs of any sort, and she was murdered after things that Jack Ruby had told her and was given a drug. I'll take a 1-minute break, continue with one or two more ways to kill, and then get on to some other subjects which are not more important, because this is very, very important to study. It's happening right now, right in front of us. This is Mae Brussell. This is the second half of broadcast number 760, and it's very important to keep in mind how many people are hanging over trees or hanging in prisons or dropping dead on the event of some very special occasions, and we better start adding this up. The back deaths as well as what happens in the future, and today things are happening very quickly. Just a few more items on the ways to kill. The New York Times, June 11th, 1978, described a drug called succinyl, Succinyl chlorine, that was given to a woman. It's supposed to be a muscle relaxant, but there's no evidence of the crime and no traces, and it's impossible to determine the cause of the death. She died of this, and the medical examiner could find no cause, and then it was discovered that this had been given to her, and she went to Harlem Hospital and died, and this had administered to her, and it passed the doctor's eyes completely. The magazine Gung Ho, March 83, has an article on how to hide your traces when you're going to kill somebody, and it has an article, when you move there, don't leave any leaf, no footprint, no scent tracks, and it's instructions on how to bury every clue or key so your adversary and the enemies won't interpret what you do, and no individual can detect or interpret the signs. Now, Franklin Camper in Alabama and Soldier of Fortune and these various gung-ho activists have ways to teach and train, and they publish a lot of material. I'm just running through a little bit of it on how not to leave those traces. So if Timothy Lee is hanging and over a tree, or Jacqueline Peters is hanging, they know how to disturb the environment and leave away any trace, so nothing is left but the body there, and not these big heavy footprints which people think should be there. Looking, oh yeah, look, here's 2 footprints, and just 2 walk away. It's not that obvious. They have courses and they teach people, and this one particular article I have from Gung Ho is all about that subject. It's called Survival Basic Evasion, and the whole thing is about how to kill and not be discovered, and the security practices to ensure that when things are inspected, there's no litter, there's no personal articles, there's no odor, and how you protect yourself and get away, and you're not linked to those particular murders. And also, if somebody goes to the coroner, from the coroner to the medical examiner, to see what these mystery deaths are, the medical examiners are so corrupt, many of them, and I've cited some from Los Angeles and New York, and Houston, Texas, and other various broadcasts. I haven't done enough on that either. There's so many articles. There's an article a long time ago, and I cite this for a particular reason. This is out of the New York Times. Inquiry by state on Dr. Gross finds medical lapses. And this is the medical examiner from New York City who was at La Costa, California with the mafia when he gave instructions on the telephone to cremate Nelson Rockefeller, the man who was removed to assure Ronald Reagan's New York GOP votes and the presidency for the GOP. Dr. Gross was charged in New York City by the crime's chief medical examiner. They accused him. He's the city, their chief medical examiner. They accused them of improperly failing to determine the manner of death in 4 people that were taken in custody where they were homicides, and that he passed over the fact that they were homicides and that bullets were involved, and these were allegedly natural causes. And there was a lot of scandal about that. And in the course of looking up a few hundred ways to kill at the CIA, and I'm not going to put any more on at this time, I came across the article, the New England Medical Journal of July 1975, that many people asked me for, and the source I'd put away in various places like Chile and so forth. This is about a chemical called cyclophosphamide. Let me spell it for you. Cyclophosphamide. C-Y-C-L-O. Cyclo. P-H-O-S. Cyclophos. F-P-H-A-M-I-D-E. Famide. Okay, cyclophosphamide. New England Medical Journal, July 1975. It was in the Earth News, October 29, 1975. It was in the London Observer. The point of it was that shots of this particular chemical were given to prisoners in Chile by Mr. Pinochet and the powers that be and the dictatorship, because when they were released from prison, they were cleared, and given, you could say, their tetanus shots or whatever they need. And the point of the article was that this particular element would cause their bladders to shrivel up and eventually cease functioning, and they would die a few years later on the outside and not attribute their death to being in the prison. They were released and then could die at home, and the government would not be blamed for their deaths. Now, I want to swing now to another subject, 2 subjects, one quickly and not too much, about Senator East, who died allegedly, San Francisco Chronicle says, from a carbon monoxide poisoning. The interesting thing about this subject, I think, is that East was coming home for, the 4th of July weekend. His family wasn't there. He's confined to a wheelchair, has polio. Nobody was at home. No companion was with him when a man's in this condition. And then the San Francisco Chronicle and Washington Post said East's last appointment, Washington, was Friday afternoon when he met at the Hart Building office with Judge Antonio Scalia to discuss Scalia's nomination to the Supreme Court. East, a member of the Senate Judiciary Committee, would have voted for the nomination. East returned home to Alexandria, Virginia Friday, then drove to Greenville. His wife was visiting her mother in South Carolina, and so forth. He was home alone, and he was found dead. I think it's interesting that Scalia was visiting East, and take of it what you can, our future Justice of the Supreme Court. Who knows what transpired or what happened, but if they were such close friends that he's there in the chambers with him, you'd think that East would at least not commit suicide until maybe 2 weeks later when Scalia is confirmed, because they're such close friends. But we don't know what transpired in that conversation. Now, an event took place out in Beverly Hills, which some of you may or may not have thought was important or interesting, but I think it is to me and to you if we share the information a little bit about the events. There was an article that was published by Jack Anderson when he had his magazine a while back. Remember, Jack had an investigative journal, and in there was an article on the way that events are told in the newspaper before they happen. And I used that material to show how there were hints that John Hinckley would be killing or trying to kill Ronald Reagan in 1981. And this magazine, The Investigator it's called, came out in September 81 with pictures of ads and information in New Yorker magazine that paralleled events seriously to the bombing attack at Pearl Harbor, and it could have been used by the Japanese to inform each other, and the FBI was aware of this and was working on what was printed in the newspaper. And I've seen, as I do my research and read all these papers, hints of things that happened that at the time you can't save everything, and then later, in fact, there are connections. Now, one of those connections was Newsweek, March 23rd, 1986. It is a picture of Rodeo Drive, and the title is Trouble on Paradise Alley. Rodeo Drive is down but not out in Beverly Hills. Well, my mother is 92 and not well, and I've been going down to Beverly Hills almost every week or every other week during the week. Rodeo Drive was a bean field when I was growing up there. We'd ride our bikes up and down there. But I pass by there and go to Beverly Drive and walk into Beverly. I've never seen Trouble on Paradise Alley. And this caught my eye because Newsweek was saying right there, trouble, and there's a street sign at Dayton and Rodeo Drive suggesting that there would be trouble. Now, Dayton, if you look at your Newsweek, is the corner where Van Cleef and Arpels is, where this shootout is going to take place in Beverly Hills. Newsweek, March 24th, the same Newsweek that had the picture of Jodie Foster the week before John Hinckley used her as an excuse for shooting Ronald Reagan. You see Dayton Drive and Rodeo Drive, and that's exactly the corner of Van Cleef and Arpels. Trouble on Paradise Alley. Now, another article, a large article in the New York Times, March the 13th, just several days apart, but again, it seemed funny, this at Rodeo Drive issue, too much glitter. Well, then they have a street map from Santa Monica Boulevard, and my folks live just 2 blocks north of Santa Monica and about 6 blocks to the left. And down the bottom is Van Cleef and Arpels, and they have the Beverly Wilshire Hotel in this little map in the New York Times with a little square. And then there's just one business. It's a triangle, Beverly Wilshire Hotels on a slant, and Van Cleef and Arpels. If you look at your New York Times, March 13th, you see the map of Rodeo Drive, the Beverly Hills Hotel, and Van Cleef and Arpels. And I don't know why that's an issue, too much glitter. There's Park Avenue, Fifth Avenue, Madison Avenue, and the European houses, streets and avenues of London and Paris and in Florida and all over the world. And Bingham, as I'm down there, I don't know what all the trouble is or what in the world they were talking about. In fact, there's on Rodeo Drive a place that has foreign newspapers, and I pick up the London Times and various newspapers there, and there's no commotion or trouble. Why were they printing this? Well, then right after that, June 23rd, these 2 articles, which I happened to save because I guess I was suspicious or feeling something. And then in June, 2 months later, there is a hostage taking, and the San Francisco Chronicle and the LA Times had stories. I'm citing the Chronicle now. Hostage seized suspect wanted in Nevada. Now, a person, Stephen Livadidis, Livaditis, was wanted for a burglary in Las Vegas, in Nevada. He was suspected. He cleaned out $250,000 worth of jewelry, and this bandit was given 5 years. He escaped from jail, which is bad because there's harsh penalties for escaping. He was recaptured. Then his sentence was suspended sentence. And studying and working with the prisoners in California, I knew the circumstances by which people were left on the outside and not given their charges of 5 or 10 or 20 years if they would do a favor in return. So he was out on a suspended sentence. Now, Nancy Reagan, the First Lady, who usually travels with her husband unless she has some other business, is sitting at the Beverly Wilshire Hotel about 1 block away, both of them identified in the New York Times on that particular article. She's in the Beverly Hills Hotel watching television at the shootout, and the article says she's very familiar with the store. It changed names. It used to be Russer's, R-U-S-E-R, and it became Van Cleef and Arpels. But that's where Ronald Reagan bought her wedding ring. So she's 1 block away watching the shootout at a store that she and Ronnie go to. And another article in the newspaper describes the situation of the manager of the store, who was in fact murdered, and he was very familiar with Frank Sinatra and other persons, and I'll go into that in one moment. But the slaying, what happened was that a man comes to the store, this robber from Vegas who's on probation and who was sentenced already, and he approaches inside the store, locked up at 10, ready to open as Hugh Skinner. This San Francisco Chronicle says, slain store manager, elegant and discreet. And if you see a picture of this Livadidis and Hugh Skinner, you know the difference. One is very worldly, well-known in Beverly Hills, well-known in Hollywood, and to the people who were the in crowd, that group, and he was one of the hostages who died in the siege. He opens the door and lets this fellow in, the one from Vegas, home state of Paul Laxalt and Frank Sinatra, very close to the Reagans and the Bloomingdales and Vicki Morgan, and this is what I'm leading to. He opens the store, Mr. Skinner, and the newspaper said Skinner himself may have escorted Leviticus into Van Cleef and Arpels Monday morning. There were 3 employees in the store. 2 were shot, and then the store manager, Hugh Skinner, was not shot. and Skinner was taken outside of the store. Now, Leviticus may have been told to take him out. He didn't kill him. He had killed the other two. And what he does, he leaves the store and goes in front where he has two remaining people alive tied to him. Actually three, Skinner and two others. And he has these hostages around him, and there's 17 helicopters above, and the police in Beverly Hills usually are every 4 inches apart. So maybe they're an inch apart now, surrounding this corner triangle, so there's nowhere to go. It's a corner street, and there's just no way you can get past. And the police department, the SWAT team, the same SWAT team that killed the 6 people of the SLA and cremated them, the SWAT team killed the store owner, and they were very open about it. And in the San Francisco Chronicle, June 26, it says, the hostage slaying a mistake, not an accident. The Deputy George Johnson, 42, a member of the police SWAT team, the Special Weapons Unit, said that he killed one of the 3 hostages with a would-be robber, and they said it's not an accidental shot. Sheriff Sherman Block said there was adequate illumination in the parking lot to get a clear sighting when he hit the person he aimed at, and the person he aimed at was the manager of the store. Now, the newspaper accounts tell how he sold to so many prominent people. He sold to Frank Sinatra, to Willie Shoemaker, to Cary Grant, Jerry Lewis, and so forth. And then the article says many men would buy their wives, their secretaries, their girlfriends, the same thing. You would never tell. Now, the keeper of the secrets, Hugh Skinner, from Van Cleef and Arpels, the shop of the Reagans, Sinatra, and so forth, is taken out on the street and killed by the SWAT team with enough light aimed at him, not the guy who went into the store, and he is dead. Nancy has not come to California or on vacation with Ronnie. She could wait and come out with him. Usually they do. She's out there alone, and she's watching this at a place where her friends shop. Now, what I'm wondering is that if this was a way similar to the way the mafia leaves dead bodies on the street so you know what happened, and the symbolism of wiping people out, is this a way for them to know those people that have blackmailed them? See, hanging over the Reagans are the stories and the photos that are not destroyed of the cabinet, suggested Edwin Meese, the Attorney General, the sex parties, Vicki Morgan, the Alfred Bloomingdale stories. These are the people that send jewelry to their wives and to their mistresses. There's a lot of money. There's a lot of things going on in Hollywood continuously. And this crowd, this particular shop, goes directly to relationships into the White House. And the First Lady sat there at the telly and watched it, just as William Graham sat at a telly in Washington and watched the Challenger blow up that day when he had written the speech for the president that night. Now, Vicki Morgan had her head cracked open, and of course people aren't talking. If they have the tapes, we don't know where they are. There have been a lot of strange things, and as soon as her head was split with a baseball bat, that ended the subject. The person allegedly who killed her without any fingerprints on the baseball bat, the patsy, Marvin Pancoast, is in a California prison in Vacaville dying of AIDS. Larry Flynt was one of the people who wanted to handle or claimed he had seen the pictures. The former he's still a publisher of Hustler. He's trying to sell it. He was taunting the president, tantalizing them. As a matter of fact, he had called me and said he had these pictures. What should he do with them? And he was telling about the intrigue. I said they wanted him to put some kind of dye or lie on them, and if they did, then they would prosecute in return this Joseph Franklin, who had paralyzed Larry Flynt and tried to kill him, or just to paralyze him and hurt him. That was supposed to be the deal. Well, I suggest to Larry Flynt that you get rid of them entirely. Don't have anything to do with them, because nothing comes but death or destruction. And I think I documented what happened to Larry Flynt and his family on World Watchers each week as it was coming down. When I was in his home, Althea, his wife, came up to me, and she was with Dennis Hopper, the movie director, and they were about to make a movie on Jim Morrison, and she said, I don't believe your stories about the rock musicians being killed, and she also wanted to make one on Jimi Hendrix. And she was just sneering at me. She didn't say, I'm glad to know you, I think your work is interesting, and so forth. So that's all I had to say to her, and she just walked away, and I didn't see her again. And then about a month or two later, you remember Gordon Novell of Permindex of the Defense Department moved into their house, and Mitchell Werbel of the CIA and the Defense Department, and G. Gordon Liddy of the FBI, the CIA, and the Defense Department, and Timothy Leary. And Althea was taken off to Cedars-Sinai Hospital, where they had administered drugs to her and got her back on drugs where she had kicked the habit, had started taking them with Larry after he had been shot. Well, I understand I talked to Paul Krasner in Los Angeles and Art Kunken, the former publisher of the LA Free Press, who worked, both of them worked for Larry Flynt, and they told me that Althea Flynt is dying of AIDS now and has the same disease as Marvin Pankos. And the brother-in-law of Jim Morrison, who became Larry Flynt's bodyguard and was with Jim Morrison when he died, can be assured there's not going to be a movie about Jim Morrison, and there's not going to be one about Jimi Hendrix. Another close associate of theirs that I linked to the Alfred Bloomingdale Vicky Morgan scandals was Roy Cohn, also simultaneously part of Western Goals with the late Larry McDonald and Edward Teller and Eugene Wigner from the Atomic Energy, one of the first daddies of the atomic bomb, and Admiral Moore, this military group that have computers into police departments. Roy Cohn, the associate of Alfred Bloomingdale, and Vicky Morgan in the kinky sex group, is now dying of cancer. They say it's AIDS. So that is the tale of what happens to people who get involved in things or know too much. And I think that the allowing this man on probation and allowing him into a store that he must have had the word to go ahead, like he was going to pick up jewelry made for someone in Vegas, killing the two people and walking out with the manager of the store, Mr. Skinner, who sells to this very crowd, while the madam, like the madam knew, sits there in her hotel, or Imelda Marcos, sits at the Beverly Hills Hotel 1 block away and watches it. And the very police department SWAT teams that were used in Beverly Hills to bring in Elmer Davis and put him in jail for 3 years for the White House burglary that turned out to be E. Howard Hunt and G. Gordon Liddy's burglary, that same Beverly Hills police shot Skinner on the street and then are arrogant enough to say in the news accounts it was not an accident. And then they said there was adequate illumination. We shot him. If you couldn't tell the difference between you, Skinner, this suave Beverly Hills jeweler from one of the finest stores in the United States, to that motley guy that looks something like Charles Manson, if the SWAT team can't tell the difference, heaven help us, and there's no apologies or excuses for those people. That's the same SWAT team that helped out Ronald Reagan and Ed Meese by killing the SLA in Los Angeles, beginning their domestic terrorism. And so Nancy is sitting there. I think it's very important the way power moves, and you can't underestimate what looked like a little vignette of a shootout, a shoot house is right, but a shootout with the first lady down the corner where Ronnie, had gone in there, and knowing the people and their friends buying from this particular jeweler and using the Beverly Hills police. It has a lot of meaning, and also the picture of the street sign corner the very 2 months before in Newsweek, and the map of the hotel and the jewelry corner in the New York Times preceding the event are similar to the other articles I've read that indicate what is happening. Now, the Reagans are having other problems, or interesting things are happening to them which also affect us, and I do think that shootout in Beverly, fall of the trial, could have some implications depending on how far people catch on or want to go. Last week, the president had a very disturbing relapse or lapse of memory at the press conference, and he explained when he was speaking to reporters in Oklahoma City, he said, I do that often. And he shot back that I've lost my mind for a moment. I do it often. And this is what he was explaining, and we got a sample of that with his press conference. Now, the San Francisco Chronicle had an article that it was in the economics section of the Chron, saying that the stock market dropped, and this didn't get much headline, when they believed that Ronald Reagan was going to die or sick. And the I don't know how many of you saw it in your newspapers or followed the market, but June 14th, there was an article, Reagan Rumor, Profit Takers Trip Up on the Dows, attributed to a rumor that Reagan was ill despite the White House assurances. It affected the stock market because there was this rumor. Now, I want to just share with you a very well-written and brilliant article by Alexander Coburn. This was in these times, sent to me by a listener to World Watchers, June 25th, 1986. very important. There's a picture of Ronald Reagan completely out of focus. I have a good friend who describes with me that Ronald Reagan is like the picture of Dorian Gray, that he's going to all fall apart some way. But this is what Alexander Coburn says, and it exemplifies what is America, what is happening, as against what we think we perceive. It's titled Out to Lunch and Dinner. In the wake of President Reagan's June 11th news conference, the media once again faced the problem how to deal with the fact that the commander-in-chief, the great communicator, the leader of the free world, was not merely out to lunch, but appeared to have absented himself from all subsequent repasts. Reagan, for those unfortunate enough to have missed the display, was glassy-eyed, slack-jawed, almost entirely incoherent. Among other disasters, he had not bothered to watch the news that evening. He was therefore unaware of the Supreme Court vote 5-4 upholding the constitutional right to abortion. When asked a question about the decision, he plunged into a prepared response, and this is usually prepared response about the earlier court decision on baby Doe. It's true that not one journalist inconvenienced the president with an inquiry about the South African crisis, but many questions were pointed. The ritual known as presidential press conference is an important avenue to advance your career, and people were standing trying to get questions to him. Later, they began asking about the SALT treaty. Reagan lunged this way and that, contradicting himself at every turn, and concluded by telling Leslie Stahl of CBS that maybe if the Russians straighten out their act, the U.S. would stick with SALT after all. Now, many of you have seen that in the news, but the important thing about this article is the way Coburn writes it up. He says, next day, a straightforward battle for power between the elected President of the United States and the invisible government of the United States, represented by White House spokesman Larry Speakes. Speakes announced flatly that notwithstanding what the President had said the previous night, U.S. no longer would be bound by the provisions of SALT. Now, I began my first published article in 1972, the one Why Was Martha Mitchell Kidnapped, saying there are two governments, one that exists, the visible, they exist side by side, and that glimpses of the invisible government were beginning to appear through the Watergate story. There were other glimpses, but the Watergate story would show you the power structure and the one that really rules it behind the power structure, the visible, invisible government. So Alexander Coburn is describing here that you have your elected president, then you're invisible, and it's represented by Speakes. And when the president says something, and you see this more and more, he comes in and says, no, that's not what he said. And Speakes talks for the National Security Agency and the Pentagon so that no matter what the president says, the course is the same. He can't sit and say something, and that's very important. They determine what he said, even if he said something else. When they have the last word, that is what he said, and that is what it holds. The article goes on, the president struck back, telling school children at lunch that the SALT II treaty was not dead. But in the late afternoon, the handlers had closed in, and the president admitted defeat. I looked at the network news program to see hardly any comment on it. ABC's Sam Donaldson did recount the amusing to-and-fro SALT story, but without any larger reflection of the president's mental speech. Just that it wasn't dead, it is dead, it wasn't, and now it is. But nothing about his mental state that caused this. NBC with Marvin Kalb, and remember Kalb is a protege of Kissinger, traveled with Kissinger. Bernard Kalb and Marvin Kalb are part of Kissinger Associates mentality under Fritz Kramer. Marvin Kalb on NBC used as a diversionary the Seymour Hersh story in the New York Times. Under the supervision, helping write this story was George Shultz of the State Department, William Casey of the CIA. It was against President Noriega of Panama, accusing him of drug smuggling, selling arms, and intelligence. And Alexander Coburn says that the purpose of this, going to Noriega at this time, which they obviously knew about for a long, long time, was to divert the attention from the Contras, from the vote, from the drug smuggling, to divert attention from embarrassing disclosures about the drug activities of the U.S.-backed Nicaraguans, and also the arrest of Theodore Shackley and a lot of their team members. And then he goes on to say, a UPI story said the president was aware that he put up a poor showing at the press conference, that he had been trying to call on new people, and the added mental burden had done him in. Now, the fact that he can reach to somebody and say, you, and that does him in, shows the mental state of the president at this time. Now, I'm wondering if that mental state has anything to do with medication he's getting when he has the polyps removed, or whether it has something to do at this time with Nancy being out in California when this operation was taking place in a surrounding they were familiar with, and was there something there which they had to eliminate or warn people about visibly on the streets to get the matter clear and keep it hidden. I assure you, the Vicki Morgan, Alfred Bloomingdale, MEESE'S REAGAN tapes will be out someday, get out someday. They can keep killing people and silencing people, and this poor Skinner, the jeweler, would know who got the jewelry, where it was sent, if these particular people in his administration are sending it to other men, if they're homosexuals, if they have mistresses, who they are. There's a lot of activity on that street, at that corner. The First Lady was there. The President was fumbling his lines. This is a man who still controls Congress to get them to change their mind on the votes, can change the courts of the United States, make it so far right you won't know it. This is what John Mitchell promised. We're in a state with a madman. He's attacked by the World Court. It doesn't matter. He will push his mediocre, dangerous, right-wing appointments and steer this country, and the attention should be given to Ronald Reagan, not so much his appointees, but to his mind. And I understand Ramsey Clark has written up a list of suggestions of impeachment. We ought to move fast and at the same time work on George Bush's relationship to the murder of Orlando Letelier, and in return the same people murdering Olof Palme in Sweden. It's time to get to these people who are doing these murders based on a lot of evidence before they turn this whole system against us and hang more people on trees, which part of their members have promised to do from coast to coast. Well, this is Mae Brussell. It may be the land of the free, 30 or 40 million spent on celebrating Statue of Liberty, but inside the country from shore to shore there are a lot of problems that have to be met before we're going to be free. Meanwhile, thanks again for the books and articles. I'll be back with you next week. Take care. This is Mae Brussell, and how can I say it? Thank you for all the material you're sending and also for what you're sharing with me.